I think we should be recording now.
Okay.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's Treasure Tale talk. Our apologies for the mix-up, but we are recording it so that all of you who had booked on but may not have received the Teams link or weren't able to get into the Teams link can still actually listen to Paul Maddocks' talk today. So without further ado, I will share my screen and we will get Paul to start the talk. Okay, can you see that, Paul?
Yes, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, great.
No
right, so away you go.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this talk. It's a bit strange that it doesn't seem like 50 years ago that my wife and I, when we met, she was just my girlfriend at the time, joined the Coventry Society. And that was mainly due to that we knew Ron Morgan. He was a very good friend of my wife's and her parents. I don't know if how many people that are watching know Coventry very well and the history of Coventry. But my mother-in-law was a councillor, and before that she was election agent to Dick Crossman, and she knew Ron Morgan quite well because he was in the Labour Party. And my wife, who was only, I think, 16 at the time, was his election agent. So it was all quite closely knit. So when he became councillor, around about the same time, there was a campaign to save Kirby House. So if we go to the next slide, please, you can do that for me. Yeah. Some of you may remember Kirby House in this state. This is photographed around about 1969, and it was really run down. You can see windows smashed and things like that. And it'd been empty for quite a long time. And this wasn't unique to Coventry. There was a lot of historic buildings in and around the city that hadn't really been touched since the Second World War. And Little Park Street, Much Park Street, areas like that were sort of very much like this. But this particular building was at one time a very grand Georgian house. And Coventry doesn't have many Georgian houses. Coventry was made, and its ups and downs. We did quite well in medieval times and Victorian times, but Georgian, we don't have much surviving. So there was a groundswell of people wanting to save this building, and there's campaigns and things like that was able to sort of put a stop on it. They wanted to demolish it and build offices. Anyway, the city council sort of then sort of thought, well, it'd be worth saving. But the problem then was who would take it on, and that was around about 1970. Anyway, out of that, it was thought that the amount of people that showed interest in a historic building, it might be worth actually setting up a society. So this was like the catalyst of the Coventry, and it was then called the Coventry Civic Community Society. So it was sort of like formed around about October 1970. But then sort of the Ron Morgan and others set about sort of setting up this society in a formal position. And they produced these, which were a membership card and rule book. And it took quite a bit of time to actually write all the rules. And then also laid out a membership card where you have and you join membership on an annual basis. And I was looking at mine, and I think if you go on the slides, I think you'll see a better view of it.
Oh, yeah.
If you scroll down a bit. Oh, that's Ron Morgan, and Ron Morgan's famous for occupying the.
It might have Sorry, go on.
No, you're right. Whitefriars Gate, as you can see, was in a derelict state as well, and he approached the city council long time before he was councillor and asked if he could live in it and at the same time do it up, and he was able to negotiate a peppercorn rent. So he had a history of actually trying to save historic buildings, and he lived in that building from about 1963 right up until his death, about 8 years ago, I think it was. If you go down another slide for me, Victoria, I'll put that slide in because it'd be interesting if people actually recognise that. You can see the dereliction of the various different streets in the city, and that's actually Much Park Street. And on the left-hand side, you can just see a bit of a building, and that's the what was then left of the Toy Museum, the old grammar school. The building in the middle, the white building, is the Greyhound pub. Some of you may remember that was about the only building standing for quite a long time, and I think it ended up being called the jailhouse just before it was actually demolished. On that site now is the Severn Trent Water headquarters. The mud in front is the site of what used to be the Franklin's building. That was a weaving manufacturers. And in the 1960s, it was a store for the Herbert Art Gallery's industrial collection. And the industrial collection was run by Peter Mitchell. And he came to the art college when I was at art college and asked if students would like to come and draw some of the things that was in store. And that's the way he kept all the bicycles, motorbikes, cars, models, anything to do in industrial history. And also the weaving looms were still in the factory. But the site had actually been bought by the university and they demolished it. That site now is where they just recently built that building in Much Park Street that runs all the way to Whitefriars Street, which is, I think it's called the Medical and Health Centre. But you can see that the general sort of untidiness and unkempt sort of roads at the time. So it was quite an unusual time. Just to the right of the picture, you might be able to see that's the road that goes down towards the Herbert. A lot of those buildings are actually timber frame buildings, and some of them were dismantled and actually taken to Spond Street. Anyway, I was going to go to the next slide. That's actually this of the membership, which I wanted to sort of show you, so you get an idea of how professional the start was, and the rules were quite specific and quite sort of explicit on what the aims were of it was like a trust and also a committee. If you go down to the next slide, let's see if I trying to remember what I actually put. Yeah, now this is the 1971 programme, which was like the first official programme, and you can see it starts with annual general meeting, which is in the October, so that's sort of like a year after the first initial meeting of the society. And what is quite interesting is some of the meetings they've got, and they was held in the council chamber, so there was quite a well-respected organisation. And you can see that the councillor Tom Meffin was Lord Mayor at the time, and they had various different sort of a regular sort of meetings every month, and they had subjects like the canal and various sort of film shows, and it was quite a extensive catalogue of various different sort of interests. Now, one of the things that did happen around about that time, this was in 1970-71, was that I got a job in rugby. And because I don't drive, I had to go there by the Midland Red and stuff like that. By the time I got back in the evening, I used to miss most of these meetings due to the sort of work. And also, a bit later on, I got married. So things started to drop off actually attending meetings, but I still kept a quite active role, but it became a little bit difficult with family and that. But what is interesting, the amount of things that were happening around about that time. If you go, I think, to the next slide. This is one of amongst of many sort of campaigns that were happening at the time. One of the biggest disruptions, and it actually started in the late 60s, was the ring road. And the ring road, in construction of it, needed to be go through a lot of Victorian, well-respected buildings. And Ford Street had the original art college, and that was had to be bulldozed. And the demolition, the owner of the demolition company kept some of the statues from the building, and I think 4 of them are kept in the Herbert Art Gallery. He kept one himself and took it to Wales and put it in his building that he was building at in Wales, about all the different scrap buildings that he was pulling down in Coventry. So, and I've been to that building, it's quite interesting. It's got the staircase from the Rudge factory, the Humber factory, and the beams to make the second floor was made from the Rudge factory. And he was like salvaging various different parts of Coventry and taking them up to Wales for his second home. Now this is the drill hall, which just behind it was Starley Road. Now Starley Road was a road that also was run down. There were some empty properties that people had bought and sort of left. One of the problems in Starley Road was that because of its poor state, but a lot of people that lived there wanted to stay there, and they didn't like being sort of forced on, and the empty properties were starting to be set on fire, and there was lots of arson about at the time, and they set up the campaign to save Starley Road, and they set up a cooperative, and they was able to save it, which is quite unusual. I think it's the only road in the whole of the ring road that's actually still got original people that lived in terraced houses within the ring road. Now, what they wanted to save the drill hall, because they wanted to save it as a community building, and the trouble was that that ended up being set on fire the day before the city council went to planning to see its future, and there seemed to be quite a bit of arson going around at the time. Any empty building was, if it got any sort of building developments, was set on fire. So this was a big loss for Starley Road, and on that site now is flats, and it's just opposite the. It's in Queen Victoria Road. On the right-hand side is IKEA, just across the traffic lights. If you go to the next slide, please, Victoria. This is actually something that did get saved. The ring road actually did miss it, but this building, it was originally the Swift factory. It'd been a few things. It'd been a chocolate factory, then became Swift car manufacturing quite a long time. It ended up being a printers, Edward the Printers, and it was mainly sort of letterpress printing, which was then declining, and lithography was becoming a big thing. Anyway, this became empty, and a hotel chain bought it, and they was going to demolish it, and the city council weren't really supporting its sort of longevity. But a member of the Coventry Society got it listed, and it went through fairly smoothly, really, and it still survives now. And it is an unusual building, in fact, there's some very historic photographs of Swift cars around about 1910 parked outside it, and so it's quite a save for Coventry Society. It's about one of the ones that Coventry Society, at the time, Coventry Civic Community Society actually saved. It was very much one of the problems with the society is that we're only a collection of enthusiasts. We have no money. We can't buy buildings. We can't. All we can do is campaign for their to be saved, and make awareness of it and try to sort of come up with solutions of the reason why it's saved, and why it could be saved and what other uses it can actually have. So if we go to the next slide. This was a big disappointment with the Coventry Society. This bit further later on. Just before we talk about that, there was a lot of other things that were going on at the same time. And of course, cities constantly change, and there's different things happen. There's been various different chairs of the Coventry Society, various different leaders for quite a long time. There was Councillor Len Hilton, who was very active and who was a good friend of the Transport Museum. And within the Transport Museum, he used to personally go out and collect various different items and donate them to the Transport Museum. And he was really quite a keen character. And he was, at the time, in the 1980s, the Coventry Civic Community Society started to produce, I don't know if you can see that, a yearly roundup, an annual report, which was quite extensive and talked about various different campaigns they had and things like that. And then not long after, in 1985, they dropped the Civic and it became Coventry Society. So it was quite a well-established organisation. It had various different sort of topics that it would cover. Was saving top shops and various different places like that. Also, was very concerned about the canal, and the canal was very much under threat at the time. I don't know if you can see things like that. But the Coventry Society at one stage had a permanent office in Earlsdon, and it was in the Gilbert Richards Centre in Earlsdon, and there was, I don't know if you can see that. In fact, I only found this picture after I did the slideshow, but it shows that it was at one time quite an active society. Like everything, we all get a little bit older, a bit sort of, and one of the things that we're now looking at is trying to get younger members. Now, back to the picture that's on your screen now is the Coventry Theatre, built just before the war and survived the war, typical of Art Deco building, was very successful, one of the largest theatres outside London. A lot of theatre companies come and try out plays and various different productions in this building before they took it to the West End, completely honed how they was going to do things. So it was very much a well-respected theatre, but like all theatres, with the advent of television and things like that, it then started to suffer. It was very popular for as a place for pop music. I saw personally the Rolling Stones there, and Deep Purple a couple of times in there, and various different bands. Even the Beatles played there, so it was quite a very popular theatre. Pantomimes were done there every year. Local car factories used to send all their children there, so it was well received. But unfortunately, in the 1980s, it became a bingo, and you can see that the complete building wasn't used when it was a bingo. It was only used the ground floor. The other various different tiers of the building weren't used at all. But you can just see on the left-hand side, a yellow car on top of a roof. Just that was the Maddocks building. And when I worked at the Transport Museum, originally the entrance was in Cook Street, around the back of the theatre. But in 1986, we was able to get an entrance onto St Agnes Lane, which then was run down the side of the Hippodrome, where the stage door was, and we was able to have the showcase at the front on St Agnes Lane. And I had built a replica of a 1910 Humber Launderette, and it's only hollow wooden build car, and we put it on the roof, and it was a beacon to show that was the entrance to the Transport Museum. If you go to, I think, the next slide, there was at the same time a suggestion where the Rudge factory was at the top of Spon Street. They were going to pull down the old Rudge building and build this building, and it was called 100 Motor Plaza. It was going to be a conference centre, hotel, entertainment centre, including the Transport Museum. You can see on the left-hand side, the Transport Museum would mainly occupy the left-hand side basement and a bit of the next floor up. And that was the side that was on the very left. You can see that was in Spon Street. The rest of that facade would be facing the Ring Road. And the idea was that they were going to move the Transport Museum into that premises, and that would be the catalyst for building the rest of it. But when I was on the committee of management committee of the Transport Museum, and we asked how much footfall or how many square feet was in that building for the Transport Museum, and it was something like 85,000 square feet. Well, that's what the Transport Museum at the time, when it was the back of the Coventry Theatre, was already. But we'd got a very large store, and we said, well, are we still going to keep the store? And they said, no, you've got to put everything in the museum. So we said, well, we haven't got enough space. So they suggested that the vehicles were stacked as visual storage. And once the whole building was full of vehicles, we couldn't collect any more vehicles, which seemed a bit sort of odd to limit a museum. And one of the things that we did want is a place to actually get the vehicles out and showcase them, run them around. So if you go to the next slide, one day when I was, thank you, Victoria. One day when I was on my way to work on my bike, I happened to remember in Palmer Lane, at the which came off the Burges, on that picture there. This was a very quick drawing I did, and watercolour in my own time at home. And you can see towards the top, the cream building, that's the Coventry Theatre. And I suggested if we actually open up the river and open up that area, and there was a pub across the road from the theatre, the Smithfield, that could be sort of at the centre of the area. Maddocks on the other side could be part of the Transport Museum, and at the back of it an arena and glazed, and also at the back of that I also even had a suggestion of the Rolls-Royce Heritage Museum to be in the back of it, and right in the distance is the Canal Basin. And my idea was to open up that area as and I called it the Centenary Square. Suggested that we move the James Starley Memorial, which is down Greyfriars Street, to this area. It was being very vandalised at Greyfriars, and it still does get vandalised now. To move it closer to the Transport Museum, so he could keep an eye on it and open up that area and open up the old grammar school, which wasn't being used at the time. And I showed this to our committee and said, you know, if we stayed where we were, just extend to the Mattersons and had an arena at the back of the Mattersons, we wouldn't need to sort of move to. This didn't go down very well and was sort of suppressed a bit. But one of the councillors naughtily, very naughty, took it to the Telegraph, and it ended up being front page, and I almost lost my job over it. So it was. If we go to the next picture down, yeah. This was what I was trying to get over, was that I'm not sure if you can see that very well, but right in the middle, you can see the Transport Museum with its curved arena, opening up the Sherborne River in the back of the Burges, which is what is going to happen now. Actually, since they've done up the Burges, the next project is to open up that river and actually make it a bit of more of an attraction. But everything that's coloured there was to sort of highlight heritage. So start from the top. On the right hand side, you can see the Herbert Art Gallery. You can actually see Civic Centre 3 with a bridge still crossed to the Council House, the Cathedral, Holy Trinity, Cathedral Lanes, and the Trinity Street, the Burges, Transport Museum, and over to the Canal Basin. And the idea was to call that general area the Heritage Quarter, and trying to sort of highlight that if all that was done up, it would actually be an attraction. So there was a sort of theme behind it, but it was very difficult of how it's going to be presented. But it did show that there was a different way of doing things. What did happen was that this idea was then taken and used to have what they call Millennium Way, which meant opening up the Priory and it coming down towards the Transport Museum. And the idea, it was supposed to be completed to go right way to the Canal Basin, but it was going to be done in 3 phases. The first phase was the St Mary's Priory down to the Coventry Theatre, and it meant demolishing the Coventry Theatre. So it was. I wanted the theatre actually to be more of a conference centre, an entrance to the Transport Museum, but it ended up being demolished. It was. It just didn't fit everything. It was too big for majority of uses, but it wasn't big enough to have concerts anymore. You couldn't get the Rolling Stones anymore. You could, they'd be going to places like the Rico and so it fell in an awkward spot. It was too big and also too small, depending on what you look at. If you could go to the next slide, please, Victoria. Thank you. Now, one of the things that the Coventry Society did in return of the millennium was Keith Draper re-erected the Coventry Society, because it more or less fell apart after the heavy loss of losing the battle to save the Coventry Theatre. A lot of effort was put in to try and save it, but it was a lost cause. It ended up that it was discovered it was full of asbestos. The cost to actually sort of remove the asbestos and actually do something with the building, it was, it was a big loss in the fact that we'd lost one of the most iconic Art Deco buildings that Coventry ever had. But one of the thoughts of resurrecting the Coventry Society was actually focus our attentions more on what we classed as the famous five. The five. Now, all these buildings, the Old County Court, Draper's Hall, the Charterhouse, the old grammar school and Whitefriars were all not being used or not empty, were empty or not being used. So we called a conference, and we was able to get the Coventry Architects Department involved, and they hosted in their lecture theatre, and we was able to invite various different speakers and invited councillors to come along to a conference, and it was to discuss these 5 buildings. And because we was in a neutral building, as in the Coventry University, and also the university architects were very interested, and they were very supportive, that the conference went really well, and it was it was more sort of like an awareness conference, and out of that to try and sort of see what could be done with these 5 buildings. Now the old county court was bought by a brewery, and they were going to have it as actually sort of be do brewing beer and actually serve the brewed beer on site. This became a bit difficult because the space and stuff like that, but it did actually end up being restored and was taken over, and you can see there it was actually, when it was not long opened, and was quite successful, and still is a successful building. And it just shows you that with a bit of imagination and repurposing of a building, it actually works quite well. The other building on the right-hand top side is the Charterhouse. Now, Charterhouse originally was owned by Colonel Wiley, who, when he died, he got no one to leave it to. His son had been killed in the Somme, so he left it to the city, and the building was actually, and the gardens was left to the city, and to be managed by the as a trust, and the trustees were all the city councillors. But over time, they didn't know this, and the building was used originally as education. It went through different stages of being used after the war as a convalescent home, old gentleman's home. Then it was used for educational purposes. Anyway, it ended up being part of the city college, and was used for adult education and things like that. And trade union and health and safety meetings were held in there. But the city college had just built a brand new building down by Swanswell, and this was no longer needed, and they was putting it up for sale. Local residents objected, and there was a campaign to save it, and it wasn't until we pointed out that it didn't belong to the city college to actually sell, they then realised that they'd got a difficult situation on their hands, and the Coventry Society were pushing to sort of save it. City Council wouldn't take it back on because it needed about £2 million repair work on it. So the trust set up, the Coventry Society set up a trust, that's what I meant to say, and 3 members of the Coventry Society were trustees, and the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce was a trustee and also a lawyer. So there was 5 trustees when it first started, and it was known as the Coventry Charterhouse Trust. And out of that has come the Coventry Heritage Trust, and it's now had lottery money, and it's almost near completion of being restored and fully restored, along with the park and things like that. The trust also took on Draper's Hall, which is the next building on the bottom on the right hand side, and that's almost near completion, being restored under the leadership of Ian Harrabin, and being able to get lots of lottery money. It helped that the city was chosen as the City of Culture. Also, before it was even City of Culture, the Heritage Lottery actually classed Coventry as one of the heritage active zones, which meant that there was focused on Coventry's heritage, and money was available for various different projects. The grammar school in the middle, the old grammar school, originally built as a hospital, and for many years it was the old grammar school. Originally, John Hales, who was sent to Coventry to in Charles II time to actually dissolve, no, in King Henry VIII's time to dissolve the monasteries, and he purchased Whitefriars and had all the pews taken out and put in the old grammar school and set up a school they called it King Henry VIII's School as an honour to King Henry VIII, who was his benefactor. Anyway, sort of the old grammar school for quite a long time had laid empty. That also had cases of people breaking in and setting fire to fires to keep warm. But what did happen was that when I was at the Transport Museum, we suggested that it came under the wing of the Transport Museum. And at the time, the manager, Barry Litwood, and I thought it might make a good Victorian school. And that was one of the thoughts that we had when I first did that original drawing. It's now been fully restored with lottery money and is now sort of up and running, and it's, hopefully when COVID is finished we will be able to go and visit again, so and use this a unique building. So that was another save. Unfortunately, Whitefriars hasn't, it's such a large building. I mean, when I first started to work for the Herbert Art Gallery in 1975, this was actually open as a museum. Margaret Rylott had set it up as a amazing museum. The top gallery is one continuous room. I'm not sure if you've ever been in it. Lovely timber framed roof, and it was a refectory. It was a refectory of the monastery. It's the only part that actually survives, which is interesting because the Charter House, it's the refectory that actually is the only part that survived. It's because it's a useful big building. The Whitefriars you can see there on the bottom left, that brickwork you can see is actually part of the original church, and that's the altar end. When they were still doing archaeology on there in the 1970s, and they discovered 3 graves still with the skeletons in there, and there was 3 bishops that were buried there. The rest of the church would have gone further back underneath the ring road, and then that building would have been very similar to that, would have been repeated, and it would create a square. So that's just one arm of the square. The building lends itself for so many things. Having that big space upstairs, it lends itself for big conferences. We used to have music recitals in there, classical music, quartets and festivals, and also what was used for sculpture exhibitions. The Coventry University used to display their sculptures in there. But unfortunately, it's the wrong side of the ring road. And when the museum opened in the 70s, I think it's opened about 1974, its attendance was abysmal. It had less attendance than the London Fort, which was averaging around about 25,000 a year. I mean, Whitefriars was lucky to get 16,000 a year. So it was very costly. And in the late 70s, with there's always cutbacks within city council fundings, and that was one of the first ones to be closed, and it's never really opened, and is used by a store now by the Herbert Art Gallery. One of the headaches is, I gather, you need to have a store to put all that store in. So hopefully it will. Ian and the team will soon solve that problem. And hopefully if the IKEA becomes a store and that can be moved into IKEA, it'd be a great opportunity for that building to be opened up again. It's an amazing building. Downstairs it's various different rooms and things like that, and the cloisters and stuff, but it's what is interesting is that I don't know if anybody remembers that Coventry actually had an earthquake in 1987, I think it was, and the building is actually made 2 walls with loose rubble inside, so it's quite a substantial wall. The earthquake actually, because it vibrated, it settled the infill, and the infill of all the stones settled, and it created a void all the way around the top of about 12 inches. And in the late 1980s, they had to do the infill of where it settled, and that cost a lot of money just to do that, to repair that. But it withstood the earthquake anyway. So it's, but it was just shows you how things can actually move and liquefy. It actually liquefied the entire inside of the stonework. Let's see what's on this next slide. I've even forgot what I've done, you know.
You want me to go to the next slide? Yeah.
Yes, please. Yes. So the Coventry Society, how it influences things. Now I've put this one up because it's Cotswold Grange. I'm not sure if anybody knows the building. It was originally built by a wealthy textile merchant, but in the time when the ribbon industry collapsed, it was actually known as his folly. Wonderful big house. Imagine that, just one person's house. Great big grounds, even had a golf course at the back of it. The golf course still survives. In fact, when it was taken over by GEC, they used it as their headquarters for their golf. And when they started making telephones and telephone exchanges on the site, that was actually used for their managers that was moving down from Manchester as digs. Those unmarried men lived there, and over time it became their headquarters for the GC Social Club. Up until fairly recently, it was quite a thriving sort of club, but when GC Plessy closed and the whole site was sold off, the City Council had a policy that any industrial land, 1/3 of it should stay industrial use, which is quite a bold thing for the City Council to do. But the unfortunate thing was they divided the land. 2/3 of it was one side. There was a main road that goes onto the site, and it is about 1/3 of the way down the site. So the 2/3 of the land to one side they made as housing, and on the other side, which was 1/3 of the site, which included this building, was made the industrial side. Well, the housing was soon snapped up and the estate was built fairly quickly. The other third, there was no uptake of making it into industrial site. There was a small industrial unit, which is the headquarters for, you wouldn't believe it, the London congestion charge is actually all the bills and things are actually from that site in Coventry on the old GC site, not far from this building. And the building was left, we reckon, deliberately like that state. And it was set on fire 3 times. And it wasn't really, there was no major fence around it or anything. And kids used to get in and sort of basically wreck it. I mean, from being a pristine building, it was just a nightmare. Anyway, sort of the City Council didn't know what to do with it. So we said, well, you're never going to get industrial units on that site. It's too small. Not much is going to happen. Why don't you let it be housing, but put a clause on that any company that takes it on as housing has got to do this building up. So the City Council changed their policy, said, yes, and it was quickly snapped up. And the original people that bought the land to make it into housing didn't do anything for a little while, and then they sold the land on to another housing company, Morris Housing, and they started to build houses on the site, but didn't do anything to this building. And we could see what was going on. They was going to ignore it, and hopefully kids would get in and completely demolish it. So we said, you better start doing some, we pushed the city council to say, you better start doing some work on it, because it's going to cost even more and more letting it be wrecked, and you've got to repair it. And they was basically saying, no, it's going to cost too much to repair. So we was able to persuade the city council to say, all the houses that you've sold so far, we won't pass it to be sold, won't allow you to sell them. So it was actually sort of almost like blackmail. You can't sell any of the houses you've made until you actually start work on this building. To their reluctance, they had to start. But by then, if you go to the next slide, you can see. Oh no, that's the finished one. I did put some of the slides above. I took them out, and then there was some aerial views. Someone took a drone over the top of it. You could see that the roof was completely burnt out, and it was just a shell, a bit like cathedral ruins. It was just everything had collapsed inside. So basically, they had to rebuild it. But you can see this is the finished version of it. It cost them £2 million in the end to actually restore it back to this original condition. And it was a condition of the sale. I mean, they should have read the small print. They couldn't sort of try and pretend that they didn't know about it. The ironic thing was this is actually opening day, and we was able to put a blue plaque on the wall of various people that lived there, and quite famous people. They made them into 15 different flats, and some of the flats are 1 bedroomed and some are 2 bedroomed. Average sale, I think it's 150 to 180,000 pound per flat. So they made a profit out of it, and the organizer, because they said, this has been great for us. Do you know of any other property like this? And we said, well, have you tried Whitley Pumping Station? Because that could do with being done up. But it just shows that some building companies have a fixed sort of thing in their mind that they can only build new. They have a adversity to building or restoring buildings. And that's mainly due to because if you're building a new building, you don't have to pay certain taxes. But if you're restoring buildings, you have to pay taxes on your materials. So it's something that maybe the government ought to change in a way of sort of changing things. What is interesting is that in 1970s, when the Coventry Society first started, there was a big sort of push within the city council to knock buildings down. Most of Hillfields was knocked down, and to put up giant, great big flats. And towards the end of the 1970s, under a Labour government, they started this, what they call the Inner City Development Fund. And one of our members, Ralph Butcher, he was a planner, and he applied for it. And he applied for Winchester Street, Colchester Street, and that area, to, instead of being knocked down, but the houses were in sound condition. The only trouble was they hadn't got inside toilets or bathrooms. So it's only a matter of building extensions to each, into the garden of each building. But he was actually almost lost his job. He was taken in. He was called into the housing officer's office and said, "What are you doing? We've got a policy of knocking down and building flats. And we can get more flats on that, or more residents on that site." And he sort of was a bit surprised and took it to the leader, George Hodgkinson, and he said, just carry on. If there's grants available and you're not disturbing the local residents, take it on. So it took a member of the Coventry Society to actually put his job on the line and actually sort of do it. So thankfully, we're in the society, we have had lots of insiders, lots of people that actually, maybe not members of the Coventry Society, but supported what was being done. And I think that's what has happened within the city. A lot of things, if you point out to them that why not look at it a different way, and the Copswood Grange is actually a good example. Just arranging a different way of approaching things, you can actually get things done. And it's one of the things that Coventry Society prides itself on, is that we've got a good mix of planners, architects, environmentalists, artists, various things, and historians. We're not a history group. We're more sort of look at planning. We like modern architecture, but what we do sort of constantly push is we like quality, and we want a quality Coventry. How are we doing for the next slide? I can't even remember what I put on the next slide. I didn't put anything, did I? No.
Oh no.
How are we doing for time now?
We've got about 5 minutes. I think.
Good. If there's anything.
Is there anything else?
No, I didn't put anything. No, what I did think of doing, I thought it'd be. No, so I just put so many pages that I could use. But what is interesting is that we still have meetings, and we still do go to various different places. But this year has been very difficult with COVID, and hopefully that we can get back to normal. We are doing outside visits. Our next visit, I think, is on the 14th of this month, and we're going to Charterhouse, and we're visiting some of our campaigns that we've been conducting over the past 10 years, and that's in the fruit of our labours. Our last meeting, which I wasn't able to go to, was the Burges, which has been done up in Hale Street, and also the city walls, Cook Street Gate and Swanswell Gate, will become apartments that you can rent. And if you're visitors to the city, and this is what's going to happen to Whitefriars Gate, Ron Morgan's old house, that it'll be done up as a place that you can hire, and hopefully within the calendar, that every heritage weekend that these will be open to the public to view, and it's along with all the historic buildings and interesting buildings that Coventry has, and that's usually held in September, and we hopefully would have lots of other things that's going on this forthcoming. I'm sure that there's going to be other campaigns that we'll look at and have try and save. This year is going to be an amazing year with City of Culture, and it just highlights how progressive Coventry has been, and I do guided tours for the cathedral and various different places, and one of the things that I do find is taking visitors that have never met Coventry before, is how surprised they are how much heritage we've still got in the city, especially around Bailey Lane from the Herbert. If you think about St Mary's Hall.
These two are giving it.
We can hear you. Can you? But, yes, it is amazing sort of when you start being pointed out that round the cathedral, Bailey Lane, based in sort of St Mary's Hall and Drapers and the grammar school. And then it leads into the 20th century. I mean, sort of the precinct and the cathedral are actually sort of icons of the post-war architecture. I mean, the cathedral was, I don't know if you remember, in the turn of the millennium, the Architects' Journal and Channel 4 got their readers and viewers to vote for their best and most iconic post-war architecture. And Coventry Cathedral came out top by a mile. And it just shows that, I don't know if you saw BBC, the One show last night, there was when they was talking about this Coventry City of Culture, and trying to think of his name from Take That, said that he had been to Coventry Cathedral and how amazed he was with the ruins and the new cathedral. So it just shows that Coventry is very much in the mind of people at the moment, and hopefully, and you must sort of be able to see all the archives and the history of the city going back to when it first was formed. Yeah, so it's well, the Coventry Society is always looking to the future, and that's why we look at all the planning applications and comment if we feel that the quality is not good enough, or we do have a bit of a moan about the universities and how they affect the city with their student buildings and stuff. Hopefully with the new tower block buildings, they'll actually mean that the terrace buildings that used to home families will actually go back to family use, and instead of housing multi-let for students. But that will we'll just have to see on that. It'll be interesting if all students go back, whether now that everything's done online, will there be actually sort of a need for so many students to actually locate. I mean, you could get your degree. We had a Zoom meeting where one of the people was actually in Portugal and sitting by the sea, making us all feel sort of envious. So you could do your degree next to the in the Mediterranean instead of being in your little bed sit in Coventry. So yeah. Well, it's lovely talking to you, and hopefully this will be adequate, and
yes,
just
well,
to give you an insight into the Coventry Society, and you know, it's a bit more knocked down than actually standing up, but victories are always well worth it. And we've had lots of different sort of amazing people being in the society, amazing chairs and things like that, amazing secretaries, and it's just nice to have been there at the beginning. My wife Sarah and I sort of still interested in the city, and lots of people still are. It just seems amazing that 50 years on you're talking about it. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
That's okay. I was just going to say, before we go, I didn't know, because we had a couple of people join us, which was great. So I don't know if those couple of people have any questions, please. And if you want to raise your hand or unmute yourself, or I can unmute you. No.
Got one. Susan.
Susan, yeah. Yeah, please, Susan. Oh, hang on. What's happening here?
Still muted.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute her.
Unmute.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Yes, please, there you go, Susan.
Well,
all right.
I worked for some years in Kirby House.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that Kirby House might have featured in your list of accomplishments.
You most likely joined late. That's how it started.
87. Oh, yes.
Yes,
I did. I couldn't work the technology. I'm not used to doing this at all. But I worked there from 87 for 20 plus years until it went into the hands of the CAB, who was suddenly allowed to do all kinds of things that we hadn't been allowed to do when we occupied the property.
What company were you working with then?
Varley Hibbs. I was a partner at Varley Hibbs.
Oh yeah, yeah. You wouldn't believe it. I've never been inside the building.
Oh, the staircase is wonderful.
Yes, yes.
Sweeping staircase.
Yeah, I understand they took the staircase out when they was doing the restoration, because more or less they took the whole building apart, just left the frontage, and then sort of had to rebuild it. But whenever they've had Heritage Open Days, because I'm so involved in staffing buildings, I've always missed out on going to see Kirby House in the interior. And I asked next.
It's fabulous, especially the office I had overlooks the front. It has an Elizabethan frieze around the top of it. Yeah. Very nice.
Yeah, Georgian it is. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's the only one of three, and there was all designed and made by brothers. But it was the actual builders that actually worked on it did an amazing job. I mean, it was must have cost them a fortune to actually do it. And I'm just looking to see what the name of the company was that actually did it. Oh, Blackberry. WA Blackberries were the company that actually did it. And the rest of the offices wrapped around it, I understand, which is very sort of typical 70s brown brick with overall top windows. But it is a jewel in Little Park Street, and it is an amazing building. So I'll try and get Roger Bailey to put it on their list of Heritage Open Day places to visit, and I'll actually have a day off and go and visit.
But isn't it another example of the council kind of waiting until something costs an absolute bomb to put right, and then miraculously it happens?
One of the problems is lots of the times that the council don't own the building, and it's more.
Did they own Kirby House?
Well, it was going to be sort of offices, and it was. There was. At the time, the city council was very much in favour of it, and because it was going to make Little Park Street mirror what was on the other side, which was then called the new council house, and it did take a bit of sort of persuading. But once they saw the groundswell of concern and interest, it was soon altered and stuff. The trouble was, that was reversed in 1970, but the actual restoration wasn't done for quite a few years afterwards. It took quite a while, and it took a company to actually take on the task of actually doing the work. One of the things I was saying earlier on, it's having to use the certain materials like sandstone or based in sort of woods or lime mortar is becoming more and more expensive, and also you have to pay all the based in VATs that if you was to go down B&Q, you don't pay VAT and stuff on most materials. It needs a government-led way of making it more viable to restore than demolish, but at the moment it doesn't, and sort of it would help if it went the other way. I mean, sort of the government did in the 70s when I was just talking about Winchester Street and Colchester Street, and that they get project grants to restore existing buildings, but that's very limited now. I know it's easy to blame the city council, but the city council's not as powerful as it used to be. No, it has no. It is a paper tiger, really. There's a classic that recently the city council refused planning permission to build a McDonald's on Whitley, by the Whitley Island, which local residents objected that it would cause gridlock. Local schools and the city council listened to the objectors and turned it down. McDonald's is such a powerful company; they've taken it to the Secretary of State, and it's been reversed. So this happens all the time. There's been loads of cases where the city councils on planning have refused things, but then on an appeal it goes to the government, and the government just reverse it. So it's a paper tiger, really, in lots of cases. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? No? Okay.
Yep.
Well, thanks ever so much for Paul for his fascinating talk. It was just to say that obviously we did record this because I think there were quite a few people who weren't able to actually get into the Eventbrite link, and so if anybody does want a copy of this, then we can provide a copy of this great talk, just so you don't miss out. Okay, but thanks.
If you can send me a copy.
Yes, I'll send you a copy. Okay.
No, it's my wife's not watching it, so she'll like to look at it later.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.